loss, terror, sorrow. In the wake of World War II, Japan was broken. The atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, signifying a conclusion to the conflict.
Wooden structures were completely collapsed by the blast. This was Hiroshima Castle. Its framework was demolished by the force of the blast, but fires of secondary origin did not occur.
That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
There were two options. The first was to give up, to fall behind. The second was to rebuild. The Sony Walkman was a huge hit, selling over 400 million units worldwide and solidifying Sony as a new cultural icon. Masaru Ibuka simply wanted to be able to privately listen to music on long flights. However, nobody expected how successful or timeless the product would become.
Many people started to use this Walkman recording, which even for the conference.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, it's ideal.
We started from very, very small company, and we found unless we produce or we make different product, unique product with our technology, we thought we cannot compete with this giant. That's why we have been trying to be unique and different from others. Because in this country, there are many, many unique creative ideas, but unfortunately, it do not become a real good industrial business.
PlayStation are part of Sony, and before they started making video games and consoles, they were actually much more famous for other pieces of tech, most notably the Walkman and then the CD Walkman, which were universally taken up around the world as a way to play your music on the move.
This was a phenomenally successful product. Everyone had one. I had one.
During this time, arcades and video games were on the rise, with companies such as Nintendo and Atari leading the race in the gaming market. Though it could be profitable, the gaming market was also highly oversaturated, and Sony chose to avoid the race altogether, focusing on their hardware. Amidst the 1980s recession, Sony would proceed to develop the CDP-101, the world's first compact CD player. The release spurred their competitors to realize their own CD players a year later, but Sony was already focused on their next projects. From the 60s, Sony ensured the standardization of their designs. They formed the Design Office, where developers and chairmen would meet to plan new innovations. This process continues to the present day in this very location, now named the Creative Center. With competition rising, Sony finally decided to branch out.
Ken Kutaragi worked for Sony. He was a brilliant engineer. He was also a maverick and a hothead. He had a reputation for ratting out his superiors.
The PlayStation was really his idea. He had the idea back in 1984 after seeing this computer graphics workstation that cost tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. It had really advanced 3D graphics, and he thought one day that technology will be cheap enough to do a home games console with 3D graphics, and basically he made it happen.
Ken Kutaragi would be a figurehead of the gaming developmental branch. From a young age, he was considered a tinkerer of sorts, destined from childhood to have a deep interest in the anatomy of technology and mechanics. Delving into the world of gaming technology, Ken would propose Sony's first collaborator be Nintendo, but not everything went according to plan.
So in the 1980s, around about, Sony was mainly an audiovisual company. It hadn't really delved all that much into video games.
The sound chip was one of the things that made the Super Nintendo Entertainment System so successful. The sound was incredible for a video game console at that time, and so Nintendo were really keen to carry on with that success. They wanted Sony to develop a CD-ROM peripheral for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. They wanted Ken Kutaragi to do it.
So he befriends Nintendo, he creates a chip to do the sound for the Super Nintendo console, and then he strikes a deal with Nintendo to create the PlayStation. And this is not the PlayStation we know. This PlayStation was going to be a hybrid of the Super Nintendo. You could plug in the cartridges, but it would also run CD-ROM games created by Sony.
So in 1991, Sony very proudly announced that they were working with Nintendo to develop this CD-ROM peripheral, but Nintendo was worried that Sony were going to take over their video game console. And so Nintendo very publicly betrayed them. They announced that they were partnering with Philips, one of Sony's main rivals, to deliver this peripheral.
And this was just a knife in the back to Sony. Sony had no idea this was coming because Nintendo hadn't been returning their calls all week. Sony had already announced that they were partnering with Nintendo, so that made them look quite foolish.
Sony was really upset at this betrayal.
Nintendo's problem with Sony was that Sony was starting to expand into movies, into TV, into music. So Nintendo was starting to worry that Sony's ambitions weren't just about supplying hardware to Nintendo, it was actually planning to launch its own games console. Now, at the time, Sony wasn't planning to, but Ken Kutaragi wanted it to. So it was Ken Kutaragi's plan, it wasn't Sony's plan at the time. Sony saw Nintendo as this kind of toy company, really. So the idea that this small toy company would betray it so publicly and team up with a foreign rival, Philips, really angered Sony. It was kind of, it's not how business is done in Japan.
And that helped Ken to persuade them to develop their own video game console as a kind of revenge on Nintendo.
Nintendo's betrayal was a shock to Ken and the heads at PlayStation. Nintendo opting for a different manufacturer enraged Sony. And in 1994, the Sony PlayStation was released. From the start, the PlayStation would be seen as a powerhouse, selling over 102 million units worldwide, massively outselling the Super Nintendo and putting Sony in the running for the highest-grossing manufacturer from a single release.
When the PlayStation first came out in 1994, it was up against Sega's Saturn. So those were the two rivals at the time. Nintendo's console was still a couple of years away. So Saturn was, like PlayStation, a CD-ROM based console. Sega originally wanted it to be a 2D graphics powerhouse, and saw what Sony was doing and slapped in some 3D graphics later. So, they were kind of trying to.
You are approaching Saturn. You are only seconds away. I have arranged for you to meet my companion.
In May 1995, at the first Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3, there was a huge amount of buzz around the Sony PlayStation. The Sony PlayStation was due to be released in the North American market that year.
Sega had its big kind of press conference, and it decides it's going to trip up Sony by announcing that the Saturn is going to cost $399 and it's launching today in selected retailers. Now, this seemed like a great move at times. Sega thought, right, we've really got Sony now.
Everyone was blown away by this, but it was a gambit that massively backfired. Sony's head of development, Steve Race, came on stage in response to the announcement from Sega and just said 3 words: $299, mic drop. $100 cheaper than the Sega Saturn.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
That, and along with the fact that Sega had supply problems because they'd released their console early, helped to doom the Sega Saturn to a mediocre commercial performance and basically ended Sega's ascendancy.
The first PlayStation console, the PlayStation 1, came into a market that was starting to really boom in home gaming. At the time, the Nintendo consoles were really leading the way. There was the NES and the SNES that had been brought out, and also Sega's offerings, the Master System and so on.
I mean, PlayStation was a very different console from everything that Nintendo had produced. Nintendo was, you know, very, very family friendly, very bright, very colourful, very sprite-oriented graphics. PlayStation, you know, from the very beginning was prioritising 3D polygon graphics. So it was more photorealistic at the time. It was, you know, more 3D, and it was deliberately going after, very aggressively, a youth-focused market, so young adults, teenagers.
PlayStation really wanted to corner the market for cool gaming. Their idea was that, as opposed to Nintendo's more family-focused games market, they really wanted to get the teenagers, and also the kids who thought they were a little bit cool as well.
PlayStation's advertising was very different to your typical video game ads. So its very first ad in Japan was this kind of grimy looking office with all these people at their desks, banging the desk, kind of demanding they have a PlayStation. In the US, you know, they had things like Crash Bandicoot, you know, an actor dressed as Crash Bandicoot going to Nintendo's offices in Seattle with a megaphone and calling on Mario to come out and, you know, let's have a fight in your parking lot. And over in the UK, they were associating PlayStation with nightclubbing and the kind of rave drug scene at the time. So it was very edgy marketing campaigns that were very adult and not this kind of kiddie kind of toy kind of vibe that Nintendo put out.
Let me tell you what bugs me about human endeavour. I've never been the human in question. Have you? Mankind went to the moon. I don't even know where Grimsby is. Forget progress by proxy. Land on your own moon. It's no longer about what they can achieve out there in your behalf, but what we can experience up here in our own time. It's called mental wealth.
And then also, whereas Nintendo is very first-party focused, so Nintendo makes Nintendo's games, PlayStation came right out the gate. They wanted to snaffle up all third-party developers, as many as possible, and make their platform as easy to develop for all of those companies as possible. So that just meant that there was just a huge, broad gamut of games that were being released on PlayStation. And, I mean, prior to PlayStation launching, it was a one company industry, and who doesn't love a bit of competition? I mean, the more companies there are, the better it is for gamers.
PlayStation really prided itself on being technically forward. The graphics were something completely set apart from the Nintendo consoles at the time. It looked new and it looked exciting. When you look back on it, it looked quite blocky, but at the time we'd not seen anything like that in the home console world. They had a famous demo, which was the T-Rex demo, which involved a T-Rex basically roaring at the camera, and that was a technical display of what you could do on that console, and that was really exciting at the time.
The Sony PlayStation was high performance, low cost, simple to use, and they used really clever advertising to get people to buy into it.
So it kind of suddenly seemed like games had arrived for adults, and that was what Sony and PlayStation brought to the mix. Nintendo had these very tight, restrictive, family-friendly policies about what games could be released. Sony didn't care that much, so you got things like Resident Evil and other horror games that Nintendo would run a mile from. So it really kind of changed the landscape and what people thought could count as a video game. It became acceptable to be in your early 20s playing video games, whereas before then, it's something you should grow out of by that point.
Fiction is quite difficult sometimes in video games because, alright, say you're playing a game in which you fly internet spaceships around a galaxy. The spaceships aren't real, the galaxy isn't real. The people you're playing with though and the friendships that you make there, those are as real as anything. And one of the most exciting things about how the new consoles use the internet is the possibility for all of that to expand and to have these huge worlds in your living room.
When the PlayStation came out, one of the things that really set it apart is it had some amazing titles from really early on in its launch. I remember personally, as a kid, I loved to play Crash Bandicoot. That was a huge thing for me. I loved that game. And then leading on from that, we also had Crash Team Racing, which was a racing game based with the Crash Bandicoot characters. But I also loved to play Tomb Raider, even though I wasn't very good at it. And that has been one of the most iconic PlayStation titles, and I think was actually a bit of a console seller for a lot of people. As well as that, there were the racing games. Gran Turismo was a huge deal, and that was only available on the PlayStation. And people loved that because it took a more kind of realistic, modern approach to racing games. To be perfectly honest, I'm no good at racing games, so I was never the best person playing them. But they were super popular, and my friends really loved them.
I would say, Mario was gaming's first mascot. Lara Croft was gaming's first icon. I mean, the fact that a video game character was gracing the cover of magazines, was selling, energy drinks, was being lusted after by a lot of people, it was just breaking new ground. And it just meant that games were entering a new level of cool. I mean, PlayStation was the 90s. So Final Fantasy VII was a huge deal when it launched. It popularized the role-playing game in the West, hands down. It was the first Final Fantasy to launch on a PlayStation console. Prior to that, they were all on Nintendo. I mean, it really made the PlayStation sing. It utilized all the technology that the PlayStation had to offer. There were those 3D polygon graphics, making gorgeous cinematic cutscenes, FMVs, I think they were called at the time, full motion videos. I think the reason that Final Fantasy VII was so successful and why it really meant a lot to people, myself included, was that it showed how games could do storytelling differently. It showed how well games could tell stories in a way that only games could. I mean, Final Fantasy's story is just... It's an epic on a scale that, few games still have to match. That's why we're, remaking it nowadays. And still people are playing and replaying it. There's, remakes and remasters and everything else. It just captured people's imaginations. It was a great story. It had great characters. And it looked absolutely gorgeous. It still does.
Excited to see the next release, millions of people would await the PlayStation 2. Outside of shops, customers filled the streets in order to grab the new console.
From the 7th of September, or could go into the shops from the 7th of September, and place an order in advance to book their place in the queue, if you will. Now, because we're only getting a limited quantity, we're going to have to stop that whole process, in fact, on the Friday the 17th of November.
With the use of innovative and edgy marketing alongside the promise for even more powerful gameplay, the PlayStation 2 would release with a bang.
It might resemble an executive briefcase or, at a push, the latest Breville sandwich toaster. But make no mistake, this Sony PlayStation 2 is the most sought-after electronic consumer item of the year, and guaranteed to cause more tears on Christmas Day than Bambi.
To this day, the PlayStation 2 remains the world's highest sold console, clocking in at over 155 million units sold.
The PlayStation 1 had been wildly popular, but at that point it was Sony's only foray really into the gaming world, and they really wanted to prove they could do it again and capture that audience again. So when the PlayStation 2 came out, that was really important for them to really capitalise on what they'd done already. And the good thing was the PlayStation 2 was really advanced graphically, but also had a killer lineup of games.
The anticipation for the PlayStation 2 was enormous, and so it just sold like lightning. I mean, no other game console managed to catch up at all. Nintendo and Microsoft, by the time they got their machines out, PlayStation's lead was sky high. It's still the biggest selling home games console to date.
Had their initial quota halved to 500,000 machines, while British shoppers will get just 165,000 before Christmas. So all hail PlayStation 2. It plays the latest video games as well as DVD films and compact discs.
A big reason for the PlayStation 2's success was that it was also a DVD player. DVDs were just taking off, and suddenly you could have a games console and a DVD player for the same price or sometimes less than a DVD player on its own. So for many people it was the way DVDs became a big thing, and that really helped drive sales. At the same time, Microsoft and Nintendo didn't release their competing consoles for a year, so PlayStation had a very long head start, and it had all the great games. It had Tomb Raider, and Microsoft and Nintendo didn't have them, so they got left behind.
Shoppers at this London store are in such a virtual world of their own that they just don't seem to care. Just before midnight, they'll be picking up the first new models available. If you didn't pre-order one of these machines back in September, then don't bother turning up tonight, because they've all sold out and there won't be any PlayStation 2s freely available on the shelves until next year. This is clearly a very big money spinner for Sony, and it couldn't have happened at a better time.
PlayStation games were often allowed to be a little bit edgier and have a little bit more adult content, and also have a little bit more violence, which, you know, could go either way, but meant that they were able to really expand on things like the shooter genres and more kind of adult-themed games that were super popular and really helped to sell their consoles.
So Silent Hill was sort of psychological horror game. You were sent into this kind of deserted, mysterious town that was quite foggy with all these weird, twisted monsters in it, and it was basically supposed to be a reflection of your main character's own psyche. So it was this really kind of creepy horror instead of this kind of B-movie zombie horror that Resident Evil offered.
Now in the 20th century, gaming consoles were improving by the year. After the PlayStation 2 came Sony's biggest competitor entry into the market. Microsoft had released the Xbox. Understanding their demographic, Sony chose to become experimental with their marketing, opting for strange adverts that subverted expectations for a gaming manufacturer. Whilst people were used to the somewhat childlike aesthetic of Nintendo, Sony chose to adopt a mature theme, incorporating directors such as David Lynch into their adverts, and purposefully making themselves out to be the rebel the kids secretly wanted to be.
Welcome to the third place.
PlayStation 2! The third place!
2004 saw the release of the massively successful Nintendo DS, a repercussion of Nintendo's continuous efforts to branch into the handheld market to great degrees of success. From the Game Boy to the DS, Sony wanted to try their own hand at the market, once again taking on Nintendo with the development of the PlayStation Portable in March 2005. The PSP did remarkably well for a company who had not delved into handheld gameplay before. Games such as God of War, Tekken, and FIFA were on the rise in many households.
Around the time that Nintendo were developing the DS, Sony developed the PSP, the PlayStation Portable. The PSP blew my mind when I first saw it. The screen was so big it took up almost the whole device. It was almost like a smartphone 10 years before smartphones existed.
Well, we have great competitors in almost every area. People like Nokia and phones do a good job. Sony in video games does a good job.
It'll give an opportunity for development staff to display their creative talents, be able to use these new devices to create more immersive worlds, and the games they create will have better graphics, better sound quality, and be an all-round more enjoyable experience.
The PlayStation 3 was considered a strange decision by many. The machine was designed for power, yet lacked quality games one would come to expect of Sony's new releases.
So in 2006, Sony wanted to release the follow-up, the PlayStation 3, but the release of the PS3 did not go well.
So PlayStation were really riding high after the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2. Everyone was excited to see what they would have in store for the PlayStation 3, but actually that's one of the few consoles where the release at least kind of fumbled the ball a little bit. And one of the reasons for that was it was releasing into quite a crowded marketplace for gaming, and it had a very high price point.
This is one of them. Dylan Scott is furious that Sony customers were only told of the problem days after criminals targeted the network.
For the first 3 days I didn't know what was going on. I wasn't sure if they'd been hacked into or if they'd shut down, or, I mean, they still haven't told me today. I've had to rely on going on their personal blog and hoping that they tell me something.
With the PlayStation 3, Sony decided it was going to create this really advanced new kind of microprocessor called the Cell, and it took years. It was incredibly expensive to do, and when they finished, the game developers who had to use this chip to actually make games found it a nightmare to use. So basically it got obsessed by its own interest in technology and lost sight of the bigger picture. They had to sell it at a really high price as well, because this was really advanced technology that was very expensive. They'd also stuck a Blu-ray player into this machine and basically hidden a PlayStation 2 inside it as well. So it is incredibly expensive compared to everything else. And that really set Sony back. It had a shortage of games because people couldn't really figure out how to make games on it for a while. And it had all this stuff in it that made it really expensive compared to the Xbox 360.
It faltered from the start due to its incredibly high selling point of $499, a whole $100 more than the Xbox, as though the history of the Sega Saturn was repeated, with Sony on the receiving end.
People weren't super willing to part with all that money for a console which they couldn't play that many games on. Eventually it did end up selling more consoles, but generally at the start it wasn't very successful.
Despite critical setbacks, Sony would use this console to be the foundation for their upcoming exclusive games. The Last of Us was a groundbreaking decision for the company, bringing focus into storytelling with narrative-driven games. This would only be the start for Sony exclusives.
For UK game developers like this, insiders predict a huge market for small firms.
Sony have been very proactive in terms of trying to get these smaller, homegrown developers onto their platform. And so I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of the number of jobs that could be created in the UK, the amount of UK content that could go forward.
Uh-oh, come on, sweet tooth. Bad princess. I love when she eats. She gets more powerful. This is awesome.
By taking their previous mistakes into consideration, Sony released the PlayStation 4 with huge success, turning the tables. It was Xbox this time whose price exceeded their competitors.
Andrew, there'll be millions of misspent youths because of this, and you're the man who's brought it to us. What do you have to say to parents?
I think that, you know, we try and be a responsible industry, but we're about delivering fun, connectivity, and an opportunity for people to play.
So Sony really did learn its lesson with the PS4. It put developers first. It made, you know, dev kits very, very easy to port games to. But most of all, it made it a more, you know, exciting place to be. The home screen was super vibrant again. You know, it had live streaming capability. You know, you had share buttons. You could share play, which meant you could literally be playing with someone who was on the other side of the world. You could pass the controller to them as if they were there on the sofa with you.
Sony PlayStation were really keen to recapture the magic of their earlier consoles with the PlayStation 4. So they brought in Mark Cerny and a bunch of other people to really make sure that it stood out and was just revolutionary at the time.
Mark Cerny was the guy they put in charge of creating the PlayStation 4. He goes back years. His career started in Atari, he worked with Sega. You know, he has a long history in video games. Essentially, to put him in charge, Sony kind of moved control of the PlayStation architecture from Japan to America. So really it was Mark Cerny's kind of leadership and vision that created the PlayStation 4.
How we use it. So, during the development of the DualShock 4, we worked with key partners and the games continue to evolve.
They also really understood that they were marketing to gamers. They knew that people wanted to be able to play games. They knew that that was a really good way to market themselves. Whereas the Xbox One, which was that generation's rival from Microsoft, tried to kind of market itself as more of an entertainment system. And they also had limits on how you could share games with your friends and with other people, which PlayStation didn't have. So PlayStation were able to basically bounce off of some of the mistakes that Microsoft made and position themselves as kind of the console that anyone who likes games would want to play.
So I think the jewel in the crown of PlayStation's exclusive titles in terms of development studios, it's got to be Naughty Dog. You know, you've got The Last of Us Part 2, the Uncharted series. All of those games, you know, they were just pinned to the consoles as a you know, a brilliant demonstration of what these consoles could do, and they're just by far and away some of the best games that you'll ever play in terms of storytelling, in terms of graphical capability, in terms of soundtrack, in terms of just everything. They're just fantastic games. You know, they're so good that they're making TV series out of them now.
Both PlayStation and Microsoft Xbox are trying to create a kind of whole entertainment system in the home. It's not just about video games anymore, it's also about watching movies and accessing the internet. Initially, Xbox focused more on that connectivity and playing massively multiplayer games, whereas PlayStation was focused on high performance and amazing graphics.
But PlayStation 4, for a start, didn't have to be connected online all the time and didn't come with Kinect, so it had a lot less kind of hassle around it. It was much more orientated towards video game players, but there wasn't, you know, once you get below the surface, there's not a huge gulf between them technically. You know, they are basically two PCs in a box under a TV. It's more the kind of way they were being promoted. that was the real difference.
I actually worked as part of a PlayStation studio for quite a few years, which was incredibly exciting to me, not only because PlayStation had been a part of my life for so long, but also because the company I worked for, Media Molecule, had originally made Little Big Planet. And when I worked in a game shop, we actually were there for the launch of Little Big Planet and Little Big Planet 2, I think. And those were games that I was so excited to play at the time, and also really built on my desire to get into game development. So then when I went to work for Media Molecule and be a part of the PlayStation studios, it just felt like a real full circle moment, from the PlayStation and Little Big Planet through to me working on Dreams.
With the implementation of the Sony VR and a library of incredible exclusive games, the PlayStation 4 would be a statement on machines specifically built for gaming. Whilst the Xbox One had a fantastic interface, Microsoft seemed to be more focused on software integration and transforming the Xbox into an all-around entertainment hub.
Okay, so you've decided to key for the PlayStation. Why? Yep. Why have you decided?
Sorry?
Why did you decide to do that?
Just because, like, I'm a gamer. I already have an Xbox One. I want to get a PS4. Okay. Just compare. Like, I'm a gamer. I want access to all the best games. So.
What upcoming game are you most looking forward to? PlayStation?
Well, right now, Killzone. I mean, there's several of the games that are out here I've already got on Xbox One. So it's mostly just Killzone for now. I'm going to give Knack a go as well.
Today?
I want to be one of the first to go home and play my PlayStation. I'm a real Sony fan. I like the company structure. I think it's a good company to be part of, yeah.
Cool. And what upcoming game are you most looking forward to?
Killzone and Battlefield 4, FIFA, all of them really. The graphics look extremely better than the PlayStation 3, and I'm glad I'm here. PlayStation
'COVID-19 forced many to remain at home with their devices. Now was more important than ever for communication and entertainment, and video games would be a vessel for it. The Nintendo Switch found incredible success in otherwise dark times. Purchases would be made to fill the void people found in their homes, and Animal Crossing: New Horizons would be their refuge.
And then, of course, after PS4 came, PlayStation VR came, PlayStation Move came eventually, PS5. PSVR is, it's being well received. PSVR 2, of course, has just come out recently.
Sony has a track record of doing this. It tried 3D TV games for a while. Then PlayStation also came out with the PlayStation 5, its latest console, which also has a VR headset.
VR in general is super interesting because the technology is incredible. It's amazing. I've tried PSVR 2 for the first time like a week ago, and it's mind-blowing. But it's still got slightly too many barriers for entry for most people to sort of adopt it, and therefore a lot of developers are slow to adopt it as well because there just aren't that many people buying it. So it's that strange thing of until we really get a killer app for PSVR, it may still just be a novelty.
PlayStation 5 is Sony's most recent console, and it has been wildly successful. Even though there were supply chain issues at launch due to the pandemic, they still have been selling out over and over again, and people just cannot wait to get their hands on a PlayStation 5. At the moment, it's the most popular console, and that's because it's just yet again another addition in PlayStation's line of technical innovation and fantastic games.
So, I mean, with PS5, you know, there's just, we've come so far from the early days of PlayStation, because some of the games that are coming out now, you know, they're just light years ahead of anything you could have possibly imagined, I'm sure, in the 90s. God of War Ragnarok is just, it's a cinematic masterpiece. It just is, you know, that you also happen to play. And you've got, you know, all the Resident Evil remakes that are coming out now as well, which are taking those early day horror games and giving them not just a new coat of paint, but like they just feel different as well. You know, they're just modernized in a really satisfying way.
Sony and Microsoft have very different looking consoles. Sony tends to do quite designery kind of looks, you know, they're kind of very elegant machines, you know, there's kind of style, you know, like PlayStation 5's got that kind of curvy kind of wings kind of look. The PlayStation 2 could stand up like the monolith from 2001. Microsoft's Xboxes are more functional, you know, the OG Xbox is like big black box, green, kind of, you know, it's big and it's noisy, you know, it's kind of, it's not subtle design from the Xbox point of view, which is not necessarily a bad thing, it works for them, but you know, they very much take the box part very literally.
Thank you very much. No worries. Thank you.
The impact of the PlayStation has contributed to childhood memories and the present alike. With focus on great stories, their games have gone as far to become gigantic franchises in their own right.
When I first got the PlayStation 5, I was really excited to play Astro's Playroom, which was an exclusive title that you could play on the PlayStation 5 at launch, which follows a bunch of little robots. But the thing I was most excited for was it used the new controller, the DualSense technology, which was, again, something that Sony had really innovated with and I hadn't seen before. And what that meant was that as well as all the usual controls you could use on that controller, it also used things like advanced haptic feedback, where it will give you different vibrations according to what you're doing. You can use the touchpad, and it was just really exciting to be able to see that next step in PlayStation technology being used so well in a really fun game.
PlayStation now are the dominant figures in the video game market. PlayStation has as much market share as the other two combined, and so they're going to be around for a really long time. The PS5 has just been released, a monster of a box, and the technology in the PS5 is allowing games to be more realistic than ever before.
I think PlayStation's legacy is that they want to make games for everyone. They want to make games for everyone from kids to adults across all different genres that allow people to play in any kind of way they want, whether that's a shooter, whether that's an adventure game or a platformer, and just be the kind of industry leaders in having that breadth of gameplay across their consoles.
I think the key to Sony's success, pettiness, and just having a lot of deep pockets and a lot of technical expertise behind you. I love that their whole thing kicked off because of a stab in the back. They really took that and ran with it.
PlayStation's legacy is to make video games acceptable for adults and to give them a sort of air of cool. You know, I wouldn't say video games are the coolest thing on earth, but it kind of got them past this kind of, oh, it's the geeky thing for kids. Sony wiped that away and changed how the world views video games. Without Sony doing what it did with the original PlayStation, that wouldn't be the case. We'd still be looking at video games in a kind of like, oh, that's, you know, isn't that for 8-year-olds, or isn't that something that kind of geeky 16-year-olds do? They really kind of moved the perception of video games. That's their biggest legacy. That and their video game controller, because before the PlayStation they were like flat rectangles, and Sony kind of made them comfortable to use, actually made them kind of things you could hold for long amounts of time.
The legacy of PlayStation is just really good games, you know, like just focusing on what players enjoy, like taking a really solid core idea and running with it, even if that means running with it for 30-something years. And I like that, you know, it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But in terms of consoles, they've innovated massively. I mean, from the original PlayStation to the PS5, you know, you've got huge innovations there. You've got, you know, DualSense controllers, haptic feedback. You've got, you know, just gorgeous, gorgeous graphics, a real sort of focus, honing in on what feels good to play.
In the Pacific, in mortal combat against a fanatic foe, the Army, the Marines, and the Navy were driving to a finish fight. The Philippines...
Though Japan suffered hardship, as many countries did during World War II, they were able to recover and focus on innovation. The post-war years provided the world with gaming on a mass scale. From old arcades to our finest consoles, Sony has always been at the forefront of technological innovation. They don't just provide good games or good consoles. PlayStation also provides us with hope. From nothing but war, Japan built itself from the ground up. No matter the dark times, the conflict we experience, we are always able to lift our heads, to focus on the present, to work for the future, and have a little fun along the way.
We're driving cars on a Mars tonight.